What kind of person learns, before adulthood, that truth can be shaped rather than obeyed? Louise Peete, born Lofi Louise Pressler in 1880 in Bienville, Louisiana, did not begin in poverty or visible instability. Her father was a newspaper publisher, her upbringing structured, her surroundings respectable. Yet by 15, she was expelled from private school in New Orleans for theft. Jewelry belonging to classmates was discovered among her possessions. It was not hunger that drove her. It was experimentation, a test of boundaries. She noticed something subtle. Authority softened when she appeared composed, even apologetic. Calmness could reduce consequences. In 1903, she married traveling salesman Henry Bosley and adopted the mobility his profession offered. Boarding houses and transient rooms created anonymity. Soon, valuables began disappearing in places they temporarily called home. Henry apologized where required. Louise adjusted, denied, and continued. In 1906, after Bosley unexpectedly found her with another man, he was discovered dead with a pistol nearby. The death was ruled a suicide. Louise did not protest the conclusion. She sold what she could and relocated. Reinvention became routine. In Boston, she presented herself as cultured and refined, at times even claiming wealthy origins. Doors opened. Credit was extended. Items vanished. When suspicion sharpened, she moved on before accusation solidified. Each exit reinforced the same discovery. Scandal endangered others more than it endangered her. By her early 30s, she had mastered identity as performance. Marriage, vulnerability, grief, all could be arranged. What mattered was access, and access required trust. The pattern forming was not loud or impulsive. It was quiet, patient, methodical. A rehearsal. The stage would expand soon, and with it, the stakes. By the time Louise returned to Texas, she understood that survival depended less on innocence and more on persuasion. In Waco, she attached herself to oilman Joe Appel, a man whose prosperity was visible in diamond rings and confident gestures. Their association was brief. Within a week, Appel was found shot to death, and much of his jewelry was gone. Louise did not deny firing the weapon. Instead, she described an attempted assault, fear, and a desperate act of self-defense. The grand jury accepted her account. The ruling taught her something decisive. When violence is framed carefully, it can be absorbed by the system rather than punished by it. In 1913, she married Harry Forote, a clerk at the St. George Hotel in Dallas. Soon after, expensive jewels disappeared from the hotel safe. Suspicion circled Forote first. His reputation collapsed under quiet accusation. Not long afterward, he was found dead from a gunshot wound, officially declared a suicide. Again, Louise stepped forward uncharged, her involvement indistinct, her composure intact. By 1915, she relocated to Denver and married Richard Peete. In 1916, their daughter, Frances, was born. For a moment, stability seemed possible. Yet financial strain and restlessness eroded the marriage. Economic recession tightened resources, and Louise's tolerance for reduced comfort remained limited. In 1920, she left Denver and traveled alone to Los Angeles, seeking opportunity in a city accustomed to reinvention. There she encountered Jacob C. Denton, a widowed mining engineer with a 14-room house on South Catalina Street. Denton intended to rent the property while traveling. For reasons unclear, he allowed Louise to move in at a reduced rate. She quickly observed his bank books, legal papers, and jewelry. Denton requested that a relative inventory his possessions, a minor precaution that suggested awareness. For Louise, scrutiny signaled risk, and risk, in her experience, required correction. Louise moved into Jacob Denton's mansion in late May 1920, presenting herself as a companion, a tenant, perhaps something closer. The exact nature of their relationship remains unclear, but proximity granted her what she valued most: unrestricted access. Within days, she understood the structure of his finances, the location of documents, the habits of a widower adjusting to solitude. On June 2, 1920, Denton disappeared. There was no immediate alarm, only explanation. Louise told visitors he had traveled unexpectedly. To others, she mentioned illness. Soon, the stories multiplied. She hired a gardener to bring soil into the basement, explaining she wished to grow mushrooms. The detail sounded harmless, even domestic. Days later, she attempted to withdraw funds from Denton's bank account and gain entry to his safe deposit box. When questioned about the signature, she introduced a dramatic complication. Denton, she said, had suffered an injury resulting in the amputation of his right arm. She claimed she assisted him in writing checks with his left hand. To different listeners, she described variations: a mysterious Spanish-looking woman, an argument, a violent encounter. Each version shifted slightly, calibrated to the audience. Meanwhile, she drove Denton's Cadillac, pawned items from the house, rented out rooms, and collected payments as if she were his authorized representative. The inconsistencies accumulated slowly. Denton's daughter grew concerned when her allowance stopped arriving. An attorney was hired. In September, with Louise back in Denver, investigators searched the Catalina property without her supervision. Beneath a wooden cubicle under the basement stairs, concealed by freshly placed earth, they discovered Denton's decomposing body. He had been shot in the head and strangled. His arm was intact. The amputation narrative dissolved instantly. Louise was arrested in Denver and returned to Los Angeles. She denied responsibility, offering alternate scenarios, suggesting unknown figures. But the physical evidence remained silent and immovable. For the first time, reinvention would face a structured response. Louise Peete's trial began in January 1921 and quickly became a spectacle. Newspapers followed every movement, particularly the Hearst publications, which treated the case as both crime and theater. Crowds gathered daily outside the Hall of Justice to watch her enter the courtroom, noting her composure, her tailored clothing, her refusal to display panic. Prosecutors avoided exaggeration. They relied instead on chronology. The sudden disappearance of Denton, the forged bank attempts, the mushroom soil in the basement, the conflicting stories about amputations and mysterious women. Witnesses described conversations in which Louise confidently explained Denton's absence. Bank officials testified about the irregular signature. Detectives outlined the discovery of the body under the stairs. The defense attempted to introduce uncertainty, presenting claims that an unknown woman had been seen with Denton and that he had been spotted alive after his supposed death. Louise herself did not testify. She remained still, allowing restraint to suggest credibility. On February 17, 1921, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. There was no visible breakdown. Observers noted only a tightening of her expression before composure returned. Her husband Richard continued to support her, writing letters and maintaining a belief in her innocence. In 1923, she encouraged him to divorce her so he could rebuild his life. He agreed but promised loyalty. Soon after, she ceased responding to him. In 1924, Richard was found dead in an Arizona hotel room from a gunshot wound, ruled a suicide. Inside prison, Louise adapted quickly. She worked as a dental assistant, tended gardens, wrote for the prison newspaper, and was described as cooperative and disciplined. Over time, officials began to view her as reformed. 18 years later, that perception would carry weight, and the door would open again. By late May 1944, the atmosphere inside the Logan household had shifted from muted concern to something sharper, less forgiving. Margaret Logan had begun quietly reviewing her accounts, tracing small inconsistencies that no longer felt accidental, including a $200 check bearing her signature but not her permission. When she confronted Louise, the response was calm, almost maternal in tone. It was, she explained, a bookkeeping misunderstanding, a minor clerical confusion easily corrected. Reassurance came smoothly, accompanied by promises of order restored. On May 29th, Margaret proposed that they sit down together and examine every document in detail. Louise agreed. That afternoon, she left her husband waiting at a nearby hotel and returned to the Logan residence for what was presented as a practical financial review. Margaret Logan was not seen publicly again after that day. Within 48 hours, Louise and Lee Judson had taken up full residence in the house. When neighbors inquired about Margaret's sudden absence, Louise offered a story designed to halt further curiosity. Arthur, she said, had suffered a violent episode, attacking his wife and biting her face so severely that disfigurement required privacy and medical seclusion. The explanation was disturbing enough to discourage visits. Shortly thereafter, Arthur was committed to Patton State Hospital, the paperwork arranged with efficient precision. Margaret, Louise insisted, required rest and confidentiality. Weeks passed, then months. Correspondence was answered in Margaret's name. Household bills were paid. Parole reports were submitted bearing her forged signature, presenting the appearance of a stable domestic routine. Arthur, meanwhile, received no visitors at the hospital. In December 1944, he died there, and Louise directed that his body be donated for medical research, describing it as his previously stated wish. Outwardly, the arrangement appeared orderly, even responsible. Louise, now 64, presided over the Logan home with quiet authority. Yet minor discrepancies began to surface. A bank clerk hesitated over a signature. A parole officer detected inconsistencies in handwriting. Doubt accumulated gradually. Investigators conducted discreet inquiries. Neighbors acknowledged they had not seen Margaret in months. Hospital staff confirmed Arthur had been alone. On December 20th, 1944, detectives arrived at the residence. Louise received them without visible alarm, repeating her narrative with measured consistency. She admitted to forging documents but framed the act as assistance given at Margaret's request. Outside, officers surveyed the yard beneath an avocado tree where the soil seemed recently disturbed. Beneath that earth lay the point at which her constructed order would finally unravel. On the evening of December 20th, 1944, detectives widened their search beyond the interior of the Logan residence. The house itself reflected routine order, not chaos. Louise maintained her explanation with composure, reiterating that Margaret was recovering privately after Arthur's violent episode. She acknowledged forging certain documents but insisted it had been done at Margaret's request to prevent unnecessary distress. While officers questioned her inside, others surveyed the garden under bright investigative lights. One section of earth, bordered neatly by flowers beneath an avocado tree, drew attention. The soil appeared recently turned, too carefully arranged to be accidental. When officers began digging, the ground gave way quickly. The odor reached them before the shape was fully uncovered. Margaret Logan's decomposing body lay buried in a shallow grave. She had been shot in the back of the neck and suffered blunt force trauma to the skull. The burial was deliberate, measured, and concealed with the same practical efficiency that had characterized earlier events. Louise was brought outside and asked to observe the discovery. She refused to look directly at the remains. At the Hall of Justice, she offered a new version of events. Arthur, she claimed, had killed his wife during a homicidal frenzy. She stated that fear of being blamed due to her prior conviction had driven her to bury the body and commit Arthur to the hospital. The explanation followed a familiar structure. Proximity acknowledged, responsibility redirected. Investigators recovered a .32 caliber revolver bearing the initials of Emily Latham. The parallel to the Denton case was unmistakable. A trusted victim, concealed remains, administrative control over property and finances. Louise was arrested and charged with murder. Her husband, Lee Borden Judson, was initially arrested as well but released due to insufficient evidence. The following day, he leapt to his death from a Los Angeles building. Once again, a man associated with Louise died amid scandal and silence, and the pattern, now undeniable, moved toward final judgment. Louise Peete's second murder trial began on April 23, 1945, in Los Angeles. Unlike her first conviction, this proceeding unfolded under the weight of precedent. Prosecutors presented not only the evidence surrounding Margaret Logan's death, but also the documented similarities to the Jacob Denton case. The state argued that the pattern was consistent: attachment to a financially stable household, assumption of administrative control, sudden disappearance, concealed remains, and financial exploitation. Bank employees testified regarding forged checks. Parole officers described falsified reports. Hospital staff confirmed Arthur Logan had received no visitors after his commitment. Forensic evidence established that Margaret had been shot and struck, contradicting Louise's account of a homicidal frenzy committed solely by Arthur. The revolver marked with Emily Latham's initials strengthened the prosecution's narrative of continuity. The defense maintained that Louise had panicked after discovering Margaret's death and feared that her prior conviction would guarantee suspicion. They suggested that Arthur, mentally unstable and physically unpredictable, was capable of violence. Louise chose to testify in her own defense. Observers described her demeanor as articulate, controlled, and almost reassuring. She spoke carefully, emphasizing loyalty and fear rather than calculation. The courtroom atmosphere was restrained but attentive. Jurors were tasked not only with evaluating the Logan murder but with deciding whether the similarities to 1920 reflected coincidence or method. On May 31, 1945, after several hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. Louise displayed minimal reaction as the judgment was read. She neither protested nor wept openly. Instead, she remained seated, composed, absorbing the decision without visible collapse. Appeals would follow, but the structural response of the state had shifted. The pattern that once allowed reinvention now frames inevitability. For the first time, there would be no relocation, no new identity, no controlled narrative sufficient to redirect consequence. Following her conviction in 1945, Louise Peete entered the final procedural stage of her life. Her attorneys filed appeals challenging aspects of the trial, including the admission of prior testimony from the Denton case and the interpretation of forensic evidence. Each motion was reviewed and denied. The courts found no reversible error. During this period, Louise continued to assert her innocence, maintaining that she had buried Margaret Logan out of fear rather than guilt. She repeated that Arthur Logan had been responsible for the violence. Yet the physical evidence remained consistent and unaltered. Unlike earlier decades, there was no narrative gap large enough to step through. The legal system had documented the sequence thoroughly. Over 2 years, the appeals process narrowed her options to none. Public interest in the case persisted, though less sensational than in 1921. She was now an older woman facing execution, a rarity in California at the time. On April 11, 1947, at San Quentin State Prison, the sentence was carried out in the gas chamber. Official accounts described the procedure as orderly and controlled, administered according to state protocol. Louise was 66 years old. She became one of the few women executed in California's history. Afterward, her body was interred at Angeles Rosedale Cemetery in Los Angeles. The administrative record closed with signatures and timestamps, the state's final assertion of authority. Yet the broader implications of her life extended beyond the chamber. 2 confirmed murder convictions, multiple suspicious deaths, and a recurring method centered on proximity and control had defined her trajectory. Where earlier scrutiny had failed, accumulated evidence ultimately prevailed. Reinvention, once her most effective defense, had lost its power. The pattern ended not in spectacle, but in procedure. And with that procedure, the narrative she managed for decades finally reached a conclusion she could not revise. After Louise Peete's execution, the immediate legal questions were resolved, but broader analysis continued. Observers revisited the earlier deaths surrounding her life. Henry Bosley in 1906, Harry Forote in 1913, and Joe Appel in Texas. Official records labeled 2 of those deaths as suicides and 1 as justified self-defense. None resulted in a conviction. Yet in retrospect, the sequence formed a pattern difficult to ignore. Each event involved proximity to wealth or stability, sudden conflict, and a male figure removed from the equation while Louise moved forward. Though definitive proof was absent in those earlier cases, the repetition of circumstances prompted reconsideration. Journalists and criminologists began framing her not simply as a twice-convicted murderer, but as a calculating offender whose methods evolved with experience. What distinguished her crimes was not overt brutality but administrative control. She relied on forged signatures, fabricated medical crises, and carefully staged explanations. Violence, when it occurred, was direct and efficient, followed immediately by narrative management. In both confirmed murders, concealment occurred within domestic spaces she controlled. In both, she assumed financial authority immediately after the victim's disappearance. The method suggested patience rather than impulse. Psychological evaluations from prison described her as intelligent, composed, and socially adaptable. She avoided dramatic displays, preferring measured responses that reduced suspicion. This restraint often worked in her favor, particularly within social expectations that perceived women, especially older women, as caregivers rather than aggressors. Her case also exposed systemic vulnerabilities. Parole supervision relied heavily on documentation she herself produced. Financial institutions initially treated forged signatures as clerical anomalies rather than warning signals. Friends and neighbors accepted implausible explanations out of politeness or discomfort. These were not extraordinary failures but ordinary assumptions exploited repeatedly. By the time Margaret Logan's body was uncovered, the pattern had accumulated too much weight to dismiss. Louise Peete's life became a study in how control, credibility, and proximity can function as instruments of harm when left unchecked. Louise Peete's history reveals a consistent strategy built not on spectacle but on access. She selected environments where trust was assumed rather than verified. Private homes, marriages, caregiving roles. In each setting, she positioned herself as necessary. A wife, a tenant, a nurse, a companion. These roles granted entry into financial records, personal routines, and emotional vulnerabilities. Once established, she gradually centralized control. Bills passed through her hands. Correspondence was filtered by her voice. Medical decisions were influenced by her accounts. When conflict arose, she introduced narratives designed to discourage inquiry. Illness, shame, violence attributed to others. Each explanation redirected attention away from her own actions. In the Denton case, the story of amputation and seclusion created a delay. In the Logan case, the claim of disfigurement discouraged social visits. Time was her ally. The longer a disappearance remained administratively plausible, the less urgent it appeared. Her conduct also exploited prevailing social assumptions. During the early 20th century, women were rarely viewed as methodical financial predators. Age further reduced suspicion. By the time of her final arrest, she was in her 60s, outwardly composed and domestic in presentation. This incongruity between expectation and behavior allowed her to operate with reduced scrutiny. Even after conviction, debates persisted regarding her psychological profile. Some commentators described her as narcissistic, others as opportunistic. What remains consistent in documented evidence is calculation. She rarely acted impulsively. Financial motives appear repeatedly, yet the method was not reckless theft. It required proximity, patience, and the gradual reshaping of circumstances. The confirmed murders reflect deliberate concealment within spaces she controlled. Suspicious earlier deaths, though unresolved, echo similar dynamics of advantage following conflict. Ultimately, her life demonstrates how credibility can function as camouflage. Violence alone did not sustain her trajectory. It was the structured management of perception that prolonged it. And when perception finally aligned with evidence, the system responded with irreversible force. When the record is closed and the dates are fixed in ink, what remains is not spectacle but a question. Louise Peete was convicted of 2 murders and executed in 1947, yet her case lingers because it challenges assumptions about how danger presents itself. She did not rely on chaos or public menace. Her method was quieter. It unfolded inside drawing rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, and offices, ordinary spaces structured by routine and trust. She adapted to each environment with composure, speaking in measured tones, offering explanations that felt socially appropriate. In both confirmed murders, financial control followed physical removal. In earlier suspicious deaths, advancement followed conflict. The sequence was consistent even when legal proof was incomplete. What distinguished her trajectory was not brutality but administration. Documents were forged, signatures were practiced, commitments to hospitals were arranged. Absence was reframed as privacy. Each act required foresight, whether motivated solely by financial gain or by a deeper need for dominance remains uncertain. Historical records do not provide a psychological confession, only observable behavior, yet behavior across decades reveals repetition without visible remorse. Even at sentencing, she maintained composure. Even during appeals, she adhered to her narrative. Her execution ended the pattern legally, but it did not resolve every ambiguity surrounding earlier deaths. Nor did it erase the institutional oversights that allowed her reintegration into vulnerable households. Her story underscores a broader reality. Harm does not always announce itself through volatility. It can emerge through competence, credibility, and the slow accumulation of unchecked authority. In that sense, the most unsettling aspect of Louise Peete's life is not the gas chamber that concluded it, but the years in which she moved unnoticed, trusted, and believed. And that leaves one final consideration: how many warnings are dismissed simply because they arrive calmly. In the years following Louise Peete's execution, her case settled into archival permanence, yet it continued to influence quiet conversations within legal and social institutions. Parole boards reviewed her file when evaluating future petitions, citing the risk of equating compliance with transformation. Financial institutions strengthened verification practices, less willing to dismiss irregular signatures as clerical mistakes. Journalists revisiting the case emphasized not only the murders themselves but the administrative gaps that preceded them. Families connected to the earlier suspicious deaths revisited unresolved grief, aware that definitive proof would likely never emerge. Her daughter, Frances, lived under the shadow of notoriety, navigating a life shaped by association rather than action. Scholars later examined Louise's trajectory within broader discussions of gender and criminality, noting how expectations of femininity and caregiving reduced scrutiny. The image of an older woman tending gardens and assisting the ill conflicted sharply with the profile of a calculated offender. That dissonance prolonged her access. The confirmed evidence shows methodical behavior anchored in financial gain and control. The unresolved episodes reinforce the perception of a pattern extending beyond courtroom boundaries. Yet historical restraint requires acknowledging uncertainty where records are incomplete. What remains undisputed is that 2 victims were buried within property she controlled, and that she constructed narratives to explain their absence. Her life illustrates how manipulation can thrive within systems built on trust and routine. When oversight relies heavily on documentation and personal credibility, a skilled fabricator can operate effectively for years. Louise Peete's story is therefore not confined to early 20th century sensationalism. It remains a case study in procedural vulnerability and psychological calculation. Long after the legal process concluded, the echo of her method persists as a reminder that composure and danger are not mutually exclusive traits.